Deep in the shadowed hollows of Appalachia, there exists a story so strange, so sinister, that local historians hesitate even to whisper it. It concerns three girls, triplets, whose very names have been scrubbed from the record: Essie, Bessie, and Dessie. Their tale is not one of innocent childhoods or small-town mischief. It is a story of darkness that crept into a family, twisted by isolation and secrecy, until their lives became something both terrifying and unrecognizable. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Histories of rural Appalachia often speak of rugged independence, but behind the hills and thick forests lay families whose habits and tragedies were carefully hidden from prying eyes. In one such family, the birth of triplets should have been cause for celebration. Instead, the three girls were immediately marked by circumstance, a legacy of isolation, generations of secrets, and whispers of genetic peculiarities that the townspeople couldn't comprehend. The triplets grew up under the watchful eyes of their father, a man whose obsession with control and perfection would define their existence. Villagers recall, in hushed tones, glimpses of the girls walking together, faces eerily similar, yet twisted by an unusual symmetry that unsettled those who saw them. They were not monsters, but something stranger, children born into a life that forced them to become something the world around them feared to name. Essie, Bessie, and Dessie learned early that they were meant to follow rules no one else could understand, trapped in a cycle of manipulation and whispered threats. Their father, determined to shape the family line, enforced a regime that blurred the lines between nurturing and de-obsession. The girls became known as the invisible triplets of the region, children who haunted the memories of those who glimpsed them, yet whose names would vanish from every official record. To this day, descendants and historians alike struggle to untangle the truth from rumor. The land they lived on has changed, forests have grown over forgotten homes, and yet the echoes of what occurred still linger. Their story is buried in the quiet despair of Appalachia, a place where the past is often left undisturbed. But some truths, no matter how carefully hidden, claw their way into the present. The origins of the triplets family trace back to one of the most isolated hollers in Appalachia. Their grandfather had settled there long before the roads were cut, long before railways brought miners and merchants into the mountains. His was a life of solitude, mistrust of outsiders, and a fierce belief that the bloodline must remain untouched by foreign hands. It was in this crucible of suspicion and silence that Essie, Bessie, and Dessie's story began. Locals remembered the family not for hospitality, but for the way they kept themselves apart. Their farm was said to be self-sustaining, cornfields, livestock, and smoke curling from the chimney even in the dead of summer. Rarely did anyone come or go. Children in town whispered that strange noises came from the woods near their land, high-pitched cries, chants, and sometimes the haunting sound of three voices singing in perfect unison. Few dared to investigate. By the time the triplets were born, the family had already developed a reputation for being not right. Some townspeople claimed they were cursed. Others believed the family's rigid refusal to marry outside their kin had warped both body and mind. Whether those whispers were truth or superstition hardly mattered. What mattered was the fear. And fear clings to memory. The triplets were said to move through town on rare occasions, thin girls with hollow cheeks, eyes too wide, and movements too synchronized to feel natural. When they spoke, it was almost always together, finishing each other's sentences like a single voice split into three. This, more than anything, unsettled their neighbors. It was not merely that they looked unusual, it was that they seemed bound by something deeper, a shared consciousness shaped by forces no one dared name aloud. The stories of their father grow darker here. He demanded silence from the girls, demanded they obey his rules, without hesitation. He was convinced they were chosen, that three born as one meant divine significance. The small Appalachian town, already struggling with its own poverty and despair, could do nothing but avert its gaze. To intervene would be to invite the wrath of a man whose authority over his land and family was absolute. And so the triplets grew, watched by many, helped by none. Their lives became a secret everyone shared but no one spoke of, a shadow stretching longer with every year that passed. As the triplets grew into adolescence, their bond became both their greatest strength and their most unsettling trait. The three girls were inseparable, never seen apart, as though separation itself might shatter the fragile order their father had forced upon them. Villagers remembered how they would walk hand in hand, moving almost rhythmically, eyes cast downward as if they carried the weight of secrets too heavy to share. In that small Appalachian town, adolescence usually meant freedom. Children found work, fell in love, or left for opportunities elsewhere. But for Essie, Bessie, and Dessie, there was no such path. Their father forbade them from interacting with outsiders. He believed their connection to each other was sacred, something not to be diluted by the world beyond their hollow. Neighbors whispered of overheard sermons drifting through the trees, the father's voice booming about purity of blood and the chosen three. The girls' appearances became more pronounced as they aged. Some recalled their unusually pale skin, almost translucent in the right light, and faces that bore uncanny resemblance not just to one another, but to earlier generations of the family. Their eyes were wide and slightly misaligned, their smiles crooked, their bodies thin as if starved of something beyond food. Yet, despite their unsettling looks, there was a haunting beauty to them, a beauty that drew fascination as much as fear. What most disturbed outsiders was the way the triplets communicated. Rarely did they speak individually. Instead, they whispered among themselves, sometimes erupting into eerie bursts of laughter that ended as abruptly as they began. When they did address outsiders, they often answered in unison, their voices blending into a strange harmony that sounded less like conversation and more like ritual. It was as if their father had trained them, or perhaps so. Their bond was so deep that words were merely an echo of a shared thought. The town began to avoid them altogether. Shopkeepers rushed their business when the girls appeared, and mothers pulled their children away from the road. Over time, the mere sight of the triplets was said to chill the blood, for their presence carried the weight of something unnatural, something that history itself would try to erase. By the time the triplets reached womanhood, the tension surrounding their family had grown unbearable. The people of the town, already wary of the strange trio, began to whisper that their father had gone beyond mere control. Rumors spread like wildfire, that he had claimed the girls not only as his daughters, but as vessels to carry forward the family line in ways no outsider dared to imagine. These whispers were never confirmed, but the silence of the triplets and the secrecy of their home made the suspicions all the more believable. Neighbors recalled seeing the girls less often. They rarely left their property, and when they did, their faces appeared hollow, drained of life. Some said their eyes looked empty, as though the soul had been beaten out of them. Others remembered their uncanny unity growing even stronger. Three women, moving like shadows, identical in posture, voice, and gaze. They seemed less like individuals and more like fragments of a single being, controlled by a will not entirely their own. It was during these years that the legends of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie took on their most sinister form. Some claimed they were witches, bound together by blood rituals in the woods. Others swore they were cursed, punished by God for the sins of their father. Children dared each other to sneak close to the family's property at night, swearing they heard strange chanting carried on the wind, or caught glimpses of candlelight flickering through the cracks of the cabin walls. The triplets' father had become a figure of dread, his name unspoken, his presence looming like a dark spirit over the valley. Few dared approach him, for his reputation was one of violence and retribution. It was said that a man who once tried to intervene disappeared soon after, his body never found, his family moving away in quiet fear. And yet, within this suffocating secrecy, the triplets endured. They were prisoners, but they were also participants in a family legacy designed to isolate, to control, and to erase individuality. Whether they were victims or conspirators remained a question that no one could ever answer fully. Their existence blurred the line between the horrors inflicted upon them and the horrors they, in turn, embodied. The breaking point came quietly, though no one could agree on when or how. Some claimed it began with a fire, others with a sickness that swept through the hollow. But most agreed on one thing. The triplets' father eventually disappeared, and when he did, the true darkness of the family came to light. Without his presence, the three women seemed to unravel. They were seen wandering the edges of town, muttering to themselves, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing in that same unison that had once unsettled the villagers. Their appearances grew even more haunting. Sunken cheeks, gaunt figures, and eyes that stared through people rather than at them. Townsfolk began to avoid them, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of dread. It was as if the triplets embodied the sins of their lineage, walking reminders of what happens when secrecy rots into corruption. Stories emerged of livestock slaughtered and left to rot, of eerie songs echoing through the mountains at night, of strange patterns burned into the ground near their cabin. The triplets denied nothing, but neither did they explain. When approached, they only stared, 3 sets of hollow eyes reflecting the same haunted thought. Some neighbors pitied them, suggesting they were merely victims of generational cruelty, women whose lives had been stolen before they began. Others feared them deeply, believing that the sisters carried the weight of curses, too strong for any outsider to break. In either case, the town's silence only deepened. The triplets lived on the edge of society, feared, pitied, and abandoned. Their names slowly erased from every church record, every county ledger, every memory that dared try to forget. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away or tried to put an end to the curse? What we do know is that the land around their cabin became a place no one dared to tread. Hunters avoided it, children refused to pass it, and even preachers skipped over it during their sermons. For decades it remained untouched, until it was finally consumed by the forest, swallowed whole by the very wilderness that had hidden their story for so long. With time, the story of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie became less history and more ghost tale. The younger generation grew up hearing whispers of the triplets, but never saw them with their own eyes. To some, they were simply shadows in the woods, figures glimpsed between the trees at dusk. To others, they were a warning, spoken of in hushed tones, when parents wanted to keep their children from wandering too far into the hills. But the truth is far more unsettling than a campfire story. For records once did exist. Court documents, census logs, church baptisms, all once bore the names of the three sisters. And yet, piece by piece, those records disappeared. Some were burned in a courthouse fire. Others went missing without explanation. And soon, nothing remained but rumor. It was as if history itself had conspired to erase them. Local elders swore the triplets lived well into old age, haunting their cabin until their final breath. Others believed they perished in the woods, their bodies left unburied, reclaimed by the earth. A handful of stories tell of 3 graves marked only by stones, hidden deep in the mountains where no road ever reached. No one could ever agree. What was undeniable, however, was the effect they left on the community. Families stopped speaking of them. Churches refused to acknowledge them. And even genealogies skipped entire branches of the family tree. This is what makes their story so disturbing. They were real, flesh and blood, bound to a father's tyranny and a community's silence. And yet, they were treated as if they had never existed at all. It is one thing to forget the dead. It is another to deliberately erase them. And in that erasure lies a question that gnaws at the edges of Appalachian history. What did the people of that valley see or fear that was so terrible it had to be wiped away? The forest, of course, remembers. Walk far enough in, the hills, and you'll find odd stone markers, remnants of paths that lead nowhere, and the faint suggestion of footsteps where no one has walked in decades. Those who've spent nights there tell of whispers in the trees, 3 voices rising together in a chorus that should have long since gone silent. The tale of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie remains one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian lore, not because of what is remembered, but because of what has been erased. Their story is a wound hidden beneath layers of silence, a reminder of how communities choose what history is worth preserving, and what must be buried forever. Think of it. 3 sisters born together, raised under the shadow of a father's obsession, shaped by isolation and fear, until they became symbols of everything their neighbors dreaded. Were they victims, or were they participants in something darker? We will never know. That uncertainty is what lingers, unsettling anyone who dares to peer too closely into their story. In the decades since, Appalachia has carried on as if the triplets never existed. Families tend their farms, churches gather on Sundays, children play in the fields, and yet, beneath it all, there remains a hollow silence. Ask an elder about the triplets and they'll turn away. Dig into records, and you'll find nothing. The only evidence lies in whispers passed down like warnings from one generation to the next. Some say if you wander the mountains long enough, you'll still encounter them, not in flesh, but in shadow. A glimpse of 3 figures, moving in perfect unison across a ridgeline. The sound of laughter carried on the wind, 3 voices harmonizing in a way that chills the blood. A sense of being watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by 3. What makes their tale so haunting is not the violence, the secrecy, or the grotesque details. It is the void. History has erased them, but the land has not. The mountains remember, the trees remember, and the silence of the people who lived among them is perhaps the loudest testimony of all. When you walk through Appalachia today, past cabins rotting into the ground and graveyards with names worn away by time, you might feel it, that weight of stories left untold, of lives erased because remembering was too painful or too dangerous. And somewhere, in that silence, the triplets endure, not as names in a ledger, not as faces in a photograph, but as shadows that history itself could not completely bury.